Hello, everybody. Sam here, and we got to talk about The Call of the Canyon. This was, as you can see by my finger, written by Zane Grey and was originally published in 1924. The edition I have is from the public domain comics reprinter Guandanaland Comics. This was part of their Western Library series, which was where they republished a lot of public domain books. They usually focus on comics, but they actually do republish a number of books that are in the public domain. And this particular Zane Grey story is in the public domain. So I'm not going to hold this up for much longer. This is a very heavy book. Because it doesn't just have Call of the Canyon, and it has three other stories. Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand, Raw Gold by Bertram W. Sinclair, and The Long Dim Trail by Forrestine C. Hooker. So this is a very heavy book. But to talk about The Call of the Canyon, we first have to talk about Zane Grey. Anyone who has a passing familiarity with Westerns has probably heard of Zane Grey at some point, because he was arguably the preeminent Western writer in the early days of the 1900s. Because he started, I believe, in the early 1900s, and he was writing all the way up to his passing in the 1930s. And when The Call of the Canyon was published, he was already very well established as an author by that point. Because a lot of his books had not only sold well, they had been adapted to the screen. Silent screens, I should say, because this was still the era of silent cinema. But he was enormously popular thanks to that, so he was already successful as an author, but he became insanely rich because he allowed for a lot of adaptations of his work in silent film. And apparently, I read somewhere that he was one of the first authors to become a millionaire. And a lot of it was due to the frequent adaptations of his work, but also the very strong sales of his books. And one interesting historical tidbit I learned, The Call of the Canyon was written in it was published in 1924, and it takes place in northern Arizona. And interestingly enough, I learned that Zane Grey had actually started vacationing in northern Arizona starting in 1923. And he started living there. He didn't live there year-round, but he vacationed there every year from 1923, I think, to pretty much the end of his life. So he'd gotten familiar with the setting of northern Arizona by this point. And this is a romance story, but it's also kind of a Zane Grey describing his romance with northern Arizona and its wilderness. So that's kind of an interesting personal tidbit to this story. But what is the story actually about? Well, the story is about a girl named Carley Burch. And Carley Burch is this New York City socialite who does all the modern things a flapper girl in the 1920s does. She races the automobiles. She flies on the airplanes. She goes to all the jazz clubs. She goes to the speakeasies. You know, doing the things a 1920s flapper girl does. But she's feeling a bit down in the dumps because she had a fiancé named Glenn Killborne. And Glenn went off to war during World War I. Remember, the story is only 6 years after World War I ended. And Glenn did not come back in a good sword. Like, he was physically okay. You know, he'd gotten gassed, but he got over it. But he was mentally not okay. Essentially, they call it shell shock in the story, but it's heavily, today we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. So while he's physically okay, he's not mentally okay. And he tells her that he still wants to marry her because they promised to be married before the war, but he needs to sort himself out. He doesn't want Carley to marry a mental cripple, if not a physical cripple. So he goes out west to kind of sort himself out. And a few months later, Carley gets a letter from Glenn saying he feels much better. He's had this long sojourn in Arizona, and he's feeling much better. So Carley says, "Oh, I'm going to surprise him. I'm going to go to Arizona, and I'm going to meet him. And once we get back in the swing of things, I'll bring him back to New York." But when she actually travels to this area of Arizona, she learns that Glenn lives inside a canyon. And it's this really long and wide canyon that, like, multiple properties are within. Like, it's one of those huge Arizona canyons that people live in. And Carley unfortunately learns that Glenn might not want to go back to New York City because he's started to enjoy the harsh Western lifestyle. And even worse, a local cowgirl by the name of Flo Hutter has started falling for Glenn because she was one of the she was part of the family, the Hutter family, that helped nurse Glenn back to health when he first arrived to the canyon. And so the story is essentially a romantic Western drama where Carley is trying to get Glenn to come back to New York, but Glenn is not fully ready to go, and Flo Hutter doesn't want him to go because she's started falling for him. So that's the essential setup for the story. Like I said, I got the Guandanaland edition. I got this before I was a Lifetime member and got all their stuff electronically. So this was a heavy book to carry around. I generally read this at home because it was kind of cumbersome to carry around, but this is the edition I had it in, so... So what works about The Call of the Canyon? Surprisingly a fair amount. I'm not the biggest fan of romances. It's not a thing of I think there are no good romances. Obviously there are, but it's one of those things where I kind of feel that it is just one of those genres that the beats and the formulas are very, very obvious, and obviously that's true with every other genre, but romance especially it's present. You can see where everything's going generally, and it just doesn't really spark for me. It doesn't catch my attention. But surprisingly, this one was a rather strong romance. And I think a lot of that has to do with the character writing, because the characters are very well portrayed. Zane Grey finds these interesting ways to show these characters at both their best and their worst, but they never become unlikable. Probably the best example is Carley Burch herself, because Carley is actually very likable, even though she's trying to force Glenn to do what she wants because she doesn't want to stay out west. Because even though it's the 1920s, it can still be a harsh life, especially when Glenn is taking up cowboying, and he hangs out in a canyon in a rough cabin raising hogs. Like it's a tough life. But Carley never really comes off as unlikable. You see why she wants to bring Glenn back, because she loves him, but you also fully understand why she does not want to stick around in this canyon. And, she's very headstrong, but she there's a quaint determination to her where she's willing to go through all the various discomforts the West throws at her in order to get Glenn back. She's willing to go horseback riding. She's willing to deal with the discomforts of the constantly changing weather in Arizona, especially northern Arizona. But she has conflicting goals with Glenn, but never in a way that makes her unlikable. And you'll see a lot of plot summaries online that says Glenn is the main character. He really isn't. It's Carley who's the main character. And it's actually nice to see Zane Grey write a female main character in a way that feels very layered and nuanced. So it was very cool seeing that. If you see a plot summary online that says Glenn Killborne is the main character, that's probably an AI summary. It was also on the Wikipedia page when I looked it up. It said, "Oh, it's this is about Glenn Killborne." It's like it's really not. Like he's what gets the plot going, but this is really Carley's story. But to be fair, Glenn is also a big part of what makes this story work. Because he essentially does the return to tradition meme, but in real life. He has this believable reason to stay because he thinks the work ethic of ranching and hog raising is really giving him meaning in life, that meaning that he kind of felt he lost in the First World War. And you understand why he wants to stay, even if it's not the easiest life. And even though if he marries Carley, who's comes from a wealthy family, he'll be set up for the rest of his life. But he'd much rather work and have that vitality than go and become the idle rich in New York City. Because remember, this is the Roaring 20s when money is flowing and everybody's flashing cash and throwing their dollar bills around. He could very much do that, but he sticks to the Western vitality. So that's kind of an interesting character trait. Another character I really liked was Flo Hutter, the cowgirl romantic rival to Carley, because she's one of those romantic rivals that is not unfriendly. She's actually a very fun character because while she and Carley both kind of know they're vying for Glenn's affection and that one of them is going to have to win in the end, they don't really get nasty with each other because Flo knows Carley is a girl of the East, but she's kind of impressed by how Carley handles herself during her tenure in the canyon. And Carley grows to like Flo because she kind of sees this Flo woman is a cowgirl, but she is still very much a woman. She's not just putting on, airs to be one of the boys because she has to. It's demanded of her. It's because she knows she wants to do it, and it's how a woman of the West holds herself. So I always like these romances where the romantic rivals really don't hate each other. They kind of respect or even like each other. And that kind of makes the romantic tension have this neat, tension to it, because you don't want to see either one of them be sad and give up or, lose their man. But it has to happen. I think that makes romances more interesting and engaging than if the romantic rival is just a total jerk. Just a mean girl who is there to steal the man. And it's kind of like, no, this approach where Flo and Carley both like each other, I think really makes the story better because you enjoy both of them. And like I said, since this is a romance western, that means there's a lot of melodrama. There's a fair amount of melodramatic moments, but they're strong melodramatic moments. Like, a lot of people use melodrama in like a negative way. They use it to say like, oh, the characters are too over the top, they're too bombastic, and the drama just becomes goofy because everyone has this huge exaggerated emotion. But I think it works here because it's not exaggerated emotion throughout the whole thing. It's exaggerated emotion at certain moments, which is what a good drama is supposed to do. Because you have this thing where people have these grandiloquent speeches, spilling out their feelings, having these, oh, woe is me moments, but they feel fitting. They don't feel like they're there just because, it's a romance, we have to put it there. It makes sense for the characters. And I think it also works because the story does a very good job at showing how Carley, Glenn, and Flo all have different goals and different things they want to do that the other three can't, that the other two just can't get on board with. And it's just these competing desires and who's going to win out or who's going to have to change in order to get what they want. And like I said, because none of the characters are like mean or terrible or annoying, that makes the melodrama feel earned because these are fundamentally good people trying to do what they feel is right. But the way the other characters are set up, they just can't reach that conclusion. So that's a very strong way to write melodrama. The other thing I really enjoyed about this is the description of nature. Like I said, Zane Grey had started vacationing in northern Arizona by this point, and he just paints this beautiful picture of northern Arizona. He mentions all the canyons, all the forests, all the various streams and creeks. Like, it's almost a travelogue for northern Arizona. And having been to northern Arizona, I can say, yeah, it is a very lovely part of the state. The descriptions he writes of these various environments and the animals in it, I go, oh yeah, this sounds like a great place to hang out. And I can see why Zane Grey was so fond of it. So, yeah, his descriptions are great. He strings words together. I'm like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have thought of this environment that way, but that is how it would be. So that's probably one of the best writing Zane Grey does in it, just his nature descriptions. But another thing I really like is that Zane Grey is very much pushing the appeal of the West. Like I said, it's sort of a return to tradition story about how Zane Grey wants people to do what the Western pioneers did and throw off the excess of the Roaring '20s frivolous excess. And Grey does really highlight the West's appeal and the way that why that could be deeply fulfilling to a certain person. But he also does not sugarcoat the fact that the West can still be dangerous even in the modern day, and he also makes it clear that it's a very tough life. You know, if you're cowboying, you run the risk of falling off your horse or getting trampled. If you aren't careful, you can get attacked by critters. If you're out in the sun too long, you'll get burnt, and if you're out in the cold too long, you get frostbitten. So he makes it very clear that, yeah, he wants to return to tradition, but he's not sugarcoating the fact of how tough a life it is, which I think makes his message work a little better than if he had just gone, oh, it's just paradise on earth, ranching and hanging out in the canyon. And it's like, he goes, well, the vitality and the work is nice, but you're not going to necessarily have an easy time of it. So I really appreciate that he sort of included that element to highlight that it's not necessarily peaches and cream out in the West. I also found this story was kind of an interesting time capsule to this time in American history, because like I said, it's right after World War II. I'm sorry, not World War II. World War I, the Great War. And it's sort of showing that American disillusionment, because even though America was on the winning side of that war, there was kind of this sensation of, yeah, we had a lot of soldiers during this war who were hurt because it was World War I, and you know, people were getting gassed, people were dying in trench warfare, and it highlights how difficult a time the American soldiers had on return. Because like Glenn points out, he goes, I came back expecting a medal or a pension. They gave me a few weeks hospital stay and told me, you're discharged from the army. And Zane Grey kind of points out how a lot of American soldiers just didn't really get anything when he came back, and they just got no resources upon their return. They were either left to fester in hospitals or just kick them out of hospitals after a certain point. And it sort of shows that idea of the government just kind of used these young men and then sort of said, all right, you're on your own now. And it's funny because in real life, this actually was a big problem in the United States. And this would continue into the early 1930s, where World War I veterans were petitioning, hey, we need help and resources. We haven't been able to function. President Herbert Hoover, there was this big riot in Washington with World War I veterans trying to get some sort of payment or remuneration for their job, for their service in Europe, and it just turned into a big problem and a big riot. So it's kind of interesting reading this and sort of seeing, the First World War, even even though we technically won the war, there were still a lot of people left disadvantaged in our own country. So it's very interesting reading that as the primer for the story. And one of the weird things I noticed about this is that one of the recurring themes in the book is this fear of America losing its identity, because the story points out at several points about the growing globalization of the world, because the steamships are getting faster, the airplanes are making advances, train tracks are crossing all the continents. And Zane Grey seems to kind of be thinking about the idea of America sort of losing its heritage due to globalization, which was kind of weird because that's actually a modern talking point today. And not just America, but other nations sort of losing their identities due to globalization. So that was kind of an interesting thing to see, especially in this early days when modern technology obviously is not modern by our standards, but 1920s technology had really started connecting the world in ways that the previous generations just never had. So this is kind of an interesting statement on that discontent a lot of Americans were feeling, not only after the First World War, but after technology has advanced so much that the world is getting smaller. So that was very interesting to read. So what doesn't work about the story? I only had a handful of things I didn't care for in the story, but they were kind of significant. The first is the character of Hayes Ruff. Now, Hayes Ruff is a worker in the canyon. He's one of the fellow cowboys. And he's pretty much depicted as a brute. Like, he's big, he can, like, hit and knock anyone out in one punch. And he's a boorish brute who, when he sees Carley dressed in an Eastern dress that's very scandalous by Western standards, he says, "Oh, that's my invitation to go up and kiss you and do other things with you." Now, to be fair, that would be fine if he was depicted as a villain. And initially the story is going that way because once Glenn hears what Hayes has been saying about Carley, Glenn goes and just smacks the tar out of him. And Hayes isn't so tough. And, I'm like, oh, okay, that'd be a pretty satisfying conclusion. But instead, Zane Grey has this thing where Hayes Ruff actually corners Carley at one point. And we think, oh, this is where something bad's going to happen. He's like grabbing her, and we think we know what's going to happen. But then the story does this weird thing where it portrays Hayes as like this ruffian, but he was an enlightened ruffian who's trying to finger wag at Carley, saying, well, if you don't want me acting this way too, you're trying to kiss you and do other things with you, then you shouldn't have worn that dress, that scandalous dress. That's against Western standards, and only a certain kind of woman wears that dress. You can guess what kind of woman. But then the story treats it, and Carley treats it as like, oh, this is my lesson of the West. Don't wear these scandalous clothes. Otherwise, men take it as like their permission to do something. And it's kind of like, no, that's like Hayes Ruff is not like this enlightened guy. He's just a misogynistic jerk. But Grey, and by extension Carley, treat as if he gave her this much needed lesson. And it's kind of like, no, he was just, it's essentially playing the classic excuse of, well, if you didn't want to be assaulted, you shouldn't have worn that dress. And it's doing it unironically. So it's sort of like, yeah, that part doesn't work by today's standards. And that part of the book does not age well. Hayes Ruff in any other story would be the villain of the piece, but here he's not, despite him doing something that even stories before and during this time were treating as villainous. So yeah, that part does not work. There's also this long speech Carley gives at the end of one of the chapters where, a slight spoiler, but after she's in the West for a while, she goes back to New York, and all of her friends are sort of judging her for not partaking in the frivolous activities. Carley's trying to make something of herself. They're like, oh, why are you doing this, Carley? Why are you trying to make something of yourself? Why are you criticizing us for being so frivolous? And it gets into this really long polemic by Carley, where she gives this speech raging against the excesses of the Roaring Twenties, saying how jazz is a terrible music that's driving us into immorality, which is really funny to think of now, considering most people who are into jazz are usually fairly mellow folks. But no, jazz is sinful. All these industrial, amazing things we've created are killing our vitality. They're sucking the lifeblood out of us. Women and men are fraternizing with people who aren't their husbands and wives too much. It's a classic, like I said, it's a return to tradition sort of story. And this whole speech is basically spelling out Zane Grey's philosophy towards the Roaring Twenties. Which is a little weird, because at one point in that long speech, Carley criticizes the movies. I'm like, Zane Grey, you sold your stuff. You sold your stories to the movies. Like, why are you calling them out for stuff? So that's sort of one of those things I go, yeah, that doesn't quite work when, let's see, I'm looking for it. Oh. Yeah, this is the part I was thinking of. Nothing wrong when the mothers of this great country let their youngsters go to the dark motion picture halls and night after night in thousands of towns all over this broad land see pictures that the juvenile court and the educators and the keepers of reform schools say make burglars, crooks, and murderers of our boys and vampires of our girls. Zane, you sold you sold your books to the silent cinema. Like, why are you complaining about it? So, just that whole section is of Carley ranting against modern day. I'm like, man, some things never change. Society, like, this same speech would work in somebody like doing a rant against social media and the internet, things like that. I'm like, okay, yeah, this in some ways that speech would still work today, but in the context of a story, it's like, no, this is turning into a political diatribe. And I think it kind of hurts Zane Grey's message, because the whole point of Zane Grey was that he's trying to show the vitality that the West gives you, and how this frivolous life in the East can sap your will. But it was much more implication. Some people say it right out, but it was much more like this subtle implication, which I think brought the message across better. Much more than Carley giving this 2-page speech about the evils of the modern New York City scene. So that part was pretty clunky too. I also didn't care much for the ending, because the ending manufactures a climax, because everything that leads up to it, the character's emotional arc should be done. They should be through based on everything that's going. But Zane Grey includes this climax that kind of feels like it's just there to pad the story out for one more chapter. And it's not necessary. And it only happens because one character decides to play a cruel prank on Carley. And they try to frame it as, oh, he's just doing a joke. But it's a pretty cruel joke. And the unrealistic thing about this story is that it didn't end with Carley taking one of Glenn's six-shooters and putting it into the guy who does this cruel joke on her. I'm like, oh yeah, no, you want a true Western story? That's what the cowgirl would have done to whoever pulled that thing on her. But yeah, it feels like it's just put in there because Zane Grey wanted something, maybe not exciting, but something with a little more drive. But it doesn't feel like a natural end. It feels like it's just there to give the characters something a little more to do. And because of that, it kind of sucks a lot of the energy out of the ending. The ending is also very abrupt, because once the cruel prank is revealed and the truth comes out, there's a quick dialogue, and then the story just stops. Like, we don't see like the sunset in the canyon or like any traditional ending. It just stops on a line of dialogue that feels like it's kind of in the middle of this discussion between Carley and this other person, than the actual ending of that discussion they'd be having. So it's an ending that's forced, and it just sort of ends abruptly. So that was kind of a downer for me. So a final ranking for The Call of the Canyon. I rank on the 5-star system, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. And I would say The Call of the Canyon is a solid 4 out of 5 stars, which is a good book in my opinion. Like I said, there's enough things wrong with the ending, and the political diatribe and the portrayal of Hayes Ruff kind of knock a star off for me, because that kind of ruins the energy of the story. But the story on the whole, I think, works really well as a romantic Western. And it uses the tropes. There's a third act breakup. There's a woman going into a foreign land in order to find a man, which isn't that like half of what the Lifetime and Hallmark Channel do? Like some woman going to a small town, finding love. But even though it uses a lot of those tropes, it uses them well. And I think a story can absolutely work if it uses standard cliches and tropes, but uses them in fun ways. And I think this one really does do a good job at that. And yeah, I guess this would be a pretty good one if you're into romantic westerns. I could see both female and male readers being interested in this. But be aware, there's a little bit of false advertising on the front of this edition, because it says 4 complete action-packed novels. Not a whole lot of action in The Call of the Canyon, aside from some like horse rides that go awry. It's a much more low-key Western than that. But so don't expect an action Western where people are blasting guns all the time. It's more of a character piece, and the Western is more of the setting than like the typical bang bang shoot 'em. So just be aware of that. If you're fine with like a more low key romantic Western, this will probably work for you. But if you're into action, this probably isn't the one for you. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer. And one of the things that I like talking about when I do these reviews is discussing whether the story I read has inspired me in any way, if I've gotten a story idea from it. This one's really easy because, no, I really didn't. Like I said, this is a very basic romance story. It has a basic romance plot. And that's been done plenty of times before. So I didn't really get any inspiration from this because I've read enough books and seen enough movies that kind of have similar plot lines, so no, there wasn't really any inspiration here. That doesn't mean it's a bad book. Like I said, I still gave it 4 out of 5 stars, but it just didn't really provoke any story ideas of my own. So, all right. Well, that is all I have to say about The Call of the Canyon. Like I said, kind of a pleasant surprise, this story, because, like I said, I haven't read a whole lot of Zane Grey, but I was always under the impression he did sort of more action westerns, and this was much more of a romance western, and that was kind of interesting to see. I kind of like that that sort of story conceit, and I think Zane Grey does a pretty good job with this kind of style. So this was a lot of fun. This was a cool discovery of June on the Range. So yeah, I enjoyed it. And if you're into romantic westerns, you might enjoy it too. So that's where I'll leave things. All right. Well, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys later. Bye.